Hi everybody, how are you today? I have something real special for you. So which gospel is first? Were you raised being taught that Mark was first, it was the simplest, and that Matthew and Luke built their more elaborate gospels off of those, and that John was kind of an outlier? Well, let's talk about the Gospel of Mark for a second in our attempt to figure out which one really was written first. So, John Mark is his name. Like many, he had a Hebrew name, John, and a Greek Gentile name, Mark. The authorship of the Gospel of Mark is known by its description and writings by apostolic and church fathers all through the 1st and 2nd centuries. Mentions of Mark's gospel in early church literature are usually made in passing. They're not writing it trying to prove that Mark existed. I only say that because now, because of certain fields and the way our culture is, there's this new movement to say, well, did this person ever even exist? And apparently our subjective, speculative ideas are the same as objective facts, so I always like throwing that caveat out there. But according to documents written by John Mark's contemporaries and successors, like Bishop Papias of Hierapolis, Irenaeus of Lyon, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Jerome, among others, there was no controversy about authorship. By the early 100s, authorship of both Matthew and Mark were common knowledge. But which one was first, though? Well, John Mark was an early Christian convert and served as the first bishop of Alexandria, beginning in either 43 or 49 AD. We're going to come back to that. It's possible he planted a church in Alexandria in 43 and then went back to be its bishop in 49. Like I said, hang on to it for a minute. He also was Peter's assistant. He'd travel with him as an interpreter. At some time, which I'm still trying to work out in the narrative, John, the apostle that Jesus loved, was living in Ephesus, taking care of Mary, Jesus' mother, and he died. When he passed away, Peter continued John's work with the Jews of the dispersion in Bithynia and Pontus, north of Ephesus. The apostle Peter was also the first bishop of Antioch between the year 41 and 48 AD. Let me give you the years I've talked about so far. I said that John Mark was Bishop of Alexandria either 43 or 49, and that Peter was Bishop of Antioch 41 to 48. Keep those years in mind. They're all overlapping and intertwined. I also said John Mark was Peter's interpreter. If you read the beginning of Peter's epistle, you see clearly that he took over for John, preaching to those in Bithynia and Pontus. Now, the gospel writer John Mark was also the nephew of Barnabas, the Apostle Paul's evangelistic companion and mentor. Irenaeus of Lyon inadvertently reveals the date of the Gospel of Mark by noting that it was penned after the death of Peter. Well, this tells us something very important, since Peter is universally said to have died at the hands of Nero during one of 10 major persecutions of Christians between the years 64 and 67 AD. So Mark is given a date of between 64 to 68 AD. Now, the authorship of the Gospel of Mark is not without controversy. More accurately, one might call them uncertainties about the chronology of events and who wrote first. Evidence leads heavily in favor of Matthew being the first gospel written because of what the New Testament itself says. See, John Mark's uncle Barnabas first met the Apostle Paul as a Christian when he introduced the former persecutor to the other apostles. Barnabas eventually recruited Paul for his first evangelistic endeavor to teach Christians in Antioch, which I mentioned before was Peter's Christian see from 41 to 48, and John Mark was his interpreter. After leaving Jerusalem, following the contentious Jerusalem Council written about in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 15, and upon Barnabas and Paul's return to Antioch in Syria to prepare and begin Paul's first missionary journey teaching there, it was suggested by some that John Mark join them. It is unlikely that John Mark would have undertaken such a trip while serving as Bishop of Alexandria, isn't it? Well, ironically, he became bishop the same year as the Jerusalem Council, 49, and around the same time as Paul's first missionary journey began. Perhaps given the workload of the apostles and disciples, it was not uncommon for early bishops to travel at various times together, regardless of leadership roles and home sees. It is also possible that if Mark became bishop in 49, that this is the reason he left Paul's first missionary journey in the middle of it so he could take over Alexandria. For reasons not given in the Bible, John Mark left partway through Paul's first journey, which one recalls had begun in Jerusalem and ended back in Antioch. In chapter 15 of the Acts of the Apostles, verse 39, it says that Mark's departure led to a contention so great that Mark and his uncle Barnabas left Paul and sailed for Cyprus, reassigning Silas to go with Paul. Well, depending on the dating of these events, John Mark could have been called back to accompany Peter on a mission as interpreter, or simply return to Alexandria where his duties as bishop would not allow him to assist his uncle in preparing Paul for his missionary work to the Gentiles. If it is possible that John Mark was bishop of Alexandria from the year 43, as I had said earlier, while Peter was bishop of Antioch from the year 41, and that after the Jerusalem Council, Mark was assigned to Peter for the purpose of he and his uncle bringing Paul along as an apostle, it is compelling that Ananias, the one who restored sight to the newly converted and no doubt traumatized Paul, is the one right up the road from Antioch and Damascus, and he would be the second bishop of Alexandria right after John Mark. Interesting. Something's going on here, guys. It seems difficult to argue that Mark and not Matthew is the first of the Gospels to have been written, since Matthew's Gospel dates to between 41 and 45. Mark's Gospel would have had to have been much earlier, and events don't seem to line up that way. Mark's Gospel isn't written until between 64 and 67, a fact attested by all the church leaders of the time and later. Mark's audience was clearly Roman because he often translated Aramaic phrases for his readers, like his Gospel, 3, verse 17, 5, verse 41, 7, verse 34, chapter 14, verse 36, chapter 15, verse 34. You see, a Roman audience would need such assistance, not the Jews of the diaspora in his home see of Alexandria, or the Syrians of Antioch, nor those in Bithynia and Pontus to whom Peter would write, and certainly not the Jewish audience to whom Matthew would write. The arguments that Mark's Gospel was the first written are quite new and quite ironic. Supporters suggest that 93% of Mark's Gospel can be found in Matthew and Luke. It is speculated that Matthew and Luke would have had a much easier time using Mark as a foundation rather than Mark abbreviating Matthew or Luke. The irony of this argument is that often skeptics point to the differences in the Gospels as evidence for a lack of veracity. Why don't all texts tell the exact same story? Yet often Matthew and Luke agree with Mark, but they don't always agree with each other. These hardly seem like compelling facts. In fact, they ignore pertinent facts, such as the work of the amanuensis and copyists of the time, and the challenges they had with converting languages to a new movement spreading among empires and countries all within a century, and the well-known fact that when recording eyewitness testimonies, slight variants reveal authenticity. Gentlemen, when learning the new Christian history of the church, it makes a lot of sense that we should perhaps at least put out there when we know these books to have been written. It is clear by the evidence that the Gospel of Matthew is the first one written, and that the Gospel of Mark is the second or third one written. Now, I hope that you'll continue watching and give us some support, give us some love, give us some likes and comments. Support if you can. Everything's down below. Talk to you next time.